how and what to do with them. So we started off by talking about do's and don'ts. How do you write a good multiple choice question? Can you use MCQs for higher order thinking, not just for recall kind of data? And what are the pros and cons? Cons being that it's really prompting information, because with some types of MCQs, the answers are there in front of the students. Actually all types, but some are easier to spot than others. And then, so that would be a con, but a pro being that you can actually examine large swathes of a syllabus with multiple choice questions, whereas if you ask for something more pointed and more interpretive and more personal, then you are narrowing down the field of what you're asking. So in terms of blueprinting, multiple choice questions are great because you can cover a large, I was going to say surface area, but at least surface area of the curriculum. So that was session 1. In session 2, Mark came along and he was talking to us about using software as an interface for delivering a multiple choice kind of test. So we spoke quite a bit about Question Mark and about Rogo and about some of the other softwares that are available, and just really the difference between using software like that and then using Wazi, our learning management system, to deliver tests, etc. So that was the practical part of how it is that we can use MCQs in our assessments. I think the question of whether you need to do an MCQ assessment in person or not is also something that we vaguely touched on but didn't really get down to. And I think a lot of that depends on how long you give students to answer questions, and therefore how much time they have to look things up if they're not in a face-to-face environment, and also how locked down people's devices are. So if they're going to do it on campus, then you can make sure that, for example, they can't access the internet or any other software that might help them. Whereas if they're going to be doing it from home, then you have to be setting different kinds of questions, because there's that ability to WhatsApp each other and to look at other sources, etc. So yes, pros and cons of doing that kind of testing, MCQ testing remotely, is different, for example, than from setting an interpretive essay remotely, where you're looking for building an argument and expressing your own opinion, in which case doesn't matter how many books you look up and it doesn't matter how many people you talk to, ultimately you have to produce your own piece of work. So yeah, depending on your circumstance, depending on your need, depending on what you're trying to assess, multiple choice questions do have great utility. The question I think we need to work on perhaps is whether they're the ultimate gauge. So at some point, I'd say maybe 10 years ago, particularly in health science education, they were viewed as being extremely useful for knowledge testing. And I'm not sure whether that's been displaced. I mean, I'd like to think that it is a little bit shakier than it was, but I'm not sure that in the mainstream sort of education, health science education circles out there, that's the thinking. So I'm going to ask you about that. I want to know if in your environment, and a lot of you are not coming from the very basic sciences where these questions are really useful, but in your environment, would you say that the primary method of examination is through multiple choice questions? It's okay if you want to say no. I just want to know. So in your sphere, do people use multiple choice questions? Dina, Ruth, yes, thank you. I did think that. In fact, to the exclusion of just about all else, or just the majority of the time?
The majority of the time.
Yeah. And I guess a lot has to do with how easy that is to administer, to set questions and to mark them, and the turnaround time.
Learning it's not that easy to set the questions.
Oh yes, I know, and it takes a very long time, and especially if you have to produce so very many of them, you certainly can struggle, and especially if you're talking about single best answer A types. Those are possibly the hardest type to set out, in some people's experience. Okay, well, now I've given Mark lots of time to run up and down the hill, and I'm still not seeing him. So I will send him one more message, and then we'll start with really what we wanted to do today, which was to take the use of multiple choice questions one step further. So we spoke about the pre-test, where you have to think up the questions, and you have to avoid all the pitfalls of writing a bad question, and you have to include all the positive things in writing a good question. And so you set questions. Then you sit around with everyone in your department, and you have open season on all the questions. So people need to understand the language, people need to understand how you're coming from in testing whatever it is you're testing. People need to make sure that what you're asking is mainstream, is not nitpicking and hair splitting. And people need to feel that the questions have actually been through a panel of fairly like-minded, fairly expert people, and so the paper is set, okay? And the questions go out, and the students engage with the test, and you send them for computer marking, and you get a spreadsheet. Is that it? Yay, the test is done. So, yes, wave around. I know it's 4:15, but clearly not. Clearly, that can't be the end of the story for lots of reasons.
They do Vivas, and some of them are doing MEQs now as well as Vivas.
Yeah.
Just like a little short essay question, which are also difficult to mark and also difficult to set.
Jennifer, what group are you talking about? Are they postgrads, undergrads?
Undergrads.
Okay, so like GEMP students.
Not GEMP, then NMFC students.
Oh, okay, even so. Even harder, because like you're talking about more languages even, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and
sorry,
then
I came in late, so I don't know if this was what this was about. Okay.
Thanks. No. So we're really still building up to it.
Okay.
And also, the idea of a fair viva.
Yeah.
So there's been all sorts of discussions about how vivas should actually be run. Should we be asking questions against a standardized list that all students get the same questions or similar questions? Do you record students during a viva? Are you allowed to have more than 3 examiners in a viva? Is that not too scary? How do examiners agree on a student, and how do you give marks for a viva? How justifiable are those marks when they're challenged? So, sure, a lot to discuss when you think about vivas. But I want to pull us back to the idea of the post-MCQ environment. So you've done the test, and the students have completed the MCQs, and you've got a spreadsheet. And then can you publish marks, and that's that? Yes, I know you don't, all of you. So let's say it. We don't just publish the marks. There's a post-test meeting where we sit down and we have to look at all the marks that students, every single statement that the students have engaged with and how they've been answered. So can you give me, anybody, reasons why it would be important to do it? Lizelle, you're saying it doesn't happen in all departments. I agree it doesn't. But why would it be important to look at the list of how students have answered the questions?
if I can come in here, I think it's important to decide as to if how you set the questions, if it was understood by all the students the same way, and if there's discriminators that you can actually then decide as a group which questions should be, or should the marks be adjusted, or should the marks not be adjusted to be fair to all students. But that doesn't happen. That discussion doesn't happen all the time. Well, in my experiences or my exposure, it doesn't happen.
Wow, that's scary, is it not? Because that's the higher order reason. Okay, that's the educationist talking. One of the first reasons of why you would need to look at how students perform on a test is because sometimes you've got finger trouble. Whoever captured the marking scheme onto the scanner might have marked a true or false or a false or true. Or the answer sheet might have been wrong, just when somebody cut and paste and cut across. So there could be a clearly true statement that everyone is marked as true, but on the answer schema, it's been put in as false. So answer schema, you're asking me, what is that? Well, the computer doesn't know what the right and wrong answers are. So when you capture your test to be marked, you have to put in a marking scheme. And if you have finger trouble and you transpose a true and a false, then almost straight away you'll see that you that you made a mistake, because a large portion of the class will get it wrong. So that's the first thing you look at. How many people in the class got an answer wrong? And what could be the reasons for getting an answer wrong? Well, the first one I've given you, that the students didn't actually get it wrong, that we got it wrong. And it's actually quite interesting how just changing the true to the false makes a difference to the marks in the test. So very well worth looking at. One sec. Cold coughing rather than hot coughing, right? Susanna, do you think Mark's got the wrong address completely? Let's just ask him. Why I'm hesitating is because oh dear, he has the spreadsheets we were going to be looking at. Are you coming? Yes, sorry. I'm also sorry for the cough, but maybe we can mute some of it. Right. So first answer why you would want to check whether a whole bunch of students got a question wrong was if we made a mistake, which is actually one of the most common reasons why a whole class would get something, inverted commas, wrong. Just as a show of hands, while I get my drink and try and catch up, is how many people has that actually happened to? Where you've looked and you think, why on earth did the whole class get this wrong? Yes, Carol, exactly. It does happen actually quite often. Kennedy, true. Dina Roos also. So if it happens quite often, Lizelle, just imagine in the departments where they don't do this kind of a check, then the poor students are at a disadvantage because we've made the mistake and nobody picks it up. So looking at the marks is one of the quickest ways of picking it up. The second reason, or another reason maybe you could think of, is the reason that Lizelle gave, that maybe the students didn't understand the question. So in our mind, it might have been fairly straightforward how it was asked, but the students don't get what it is you're asking. And that could be for any number of reasons. For a start, did the person who lectured the course material set the question? And if they didn't, then perhaps they used different terminology for the same thing, or they explained it differently. So yeah, most definitely. Yeah, that definitely does happen. Dina Ruth, go ahead.
Or I was just thinking now, students have minds that think, and more than one answer can be correct. And as a lecturer, or as a MCQ setter, we just need to review and say, oh, actually A and B could be correct, or A and C, or B and D. So again, it's just the way we think, like you're saying, Shira, I think the way we set a question and then the way the students receive the question. But maybe if we think a little bit more, there's a possibility that there's more than one answer to the question.
Yeah, most definitely. And Mark, I'm so happy to see your hand. I'm just going to finish off Dina Ruth's point, which is sometimes the very, very, very bright and very prepared students in the class get MCQs wrong because they know so much more than what you were aiming at in that question, and they see so many more truths in the question than we have marked as correct. So it sometimes shoots you in the foot if you know too much and you don't answer straightforwardly. Mark, go ahead. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Right. It's wonderful to see everybody else. But as Dina Ruth was saying, one of the things when looking at computer-based systems is the inflexibility and the fact that you need to be able to modify things and say that we thought that there was one correct answer, but actually there are more. On further reflection, it's that there are more correct answers. And I think it becomes very important in the fact of, like, we don't know everything about science, and it's wonderful to get new answers. And this whole concept that, there can be more than one correct answer, and research is a good idea.
So that's brilliant. It's also another really good reason for looking at the stats after the test, because only if something really is ambiguous will a whole group of students misinterpret. I think the one thing we have to be careful of is the what then step. So if we're looking at a question that a whole bunch of students got wrong, so we said the first what then is check to see if we're right or wrong, and if we're wrong, then just fix it. That seems like an easy step. But the second reason that students are misinterpreting what was asked, or we've asked it in an awkward way, or someone who didn't lecture the course material set the question and therefore misinterpreted how it could be answered. For all of those reasons, then what do we do? Are we at fault? Are the students at fault? What should you do if most of the class has, inverted commas, failed a question? Any suggestions? Let them fight it out and give their reasoning for why they think your answer's wrong. You've got to be tough to be able to do that, right?
Well, if they can give a proper justification and evidence to prove me wrong, I'm open to their suggestions, but then it has to be justified. They cannot just say just because they need 1 mark. They can challenge, but if they've got reason and can justify their thought process, then I'm open for the discussion.
So Lizelle, that's it. It's a discussion, and then the student comes to you and discusses, and you say, okay, I see your reasoning, and I see why the question was ambiguous, therefore I'll give you the mark. But if nobody else comes to you and they've also marked the same option as that student, how fair is that to a whole class? So would you then give the mark to everyone who's chosen B instead of A?
No, because it might not be that they've got the same reasoning. So I would open it to say that if you've got want to challenge any marks, you can come to me. Afford the opportunity and give a deadline up to this date. It's not an open extended invitation, but because that one student might have a different type of reasoning, and if somebody else has got the same reasoning, and if more than one, or if there's a tendency that everybody's coming with the same reasoning, then yes, by all means, then do it across the board. But you cannot just make it on an individual. With one student. Again, it's like, is there a trend, and has everybody got the same kind of idea, or is it a fluke that one student have got the sense of challenging and coming up with a different answer?
Jennifer, weigh in. Tell us what you're thinking.
What I just want to know, are you referring to multiple choice questions? Because how do they know which question was wrong? They don't get feedback from that because they get the mark. So I mean, how do you know whether you can discuss it?
Yeah, brilliant point. So that's the step after the meeting, right? So you have a post-MCQ meeting and you debate all the answers that were right and wrong and whether we should leave them in and whether we should take them out and whether it's fair and whether it's not fair. And after that, what's supposed to happen is that the class gets feedback. And feedback is not just a mark. Okay, you got 75% in this test. Feedback is about knowing what you got right and what you got wrong. And it's not even good feedback for a lecturer to go through the MCQ test and say, question 1B, question 3C, question 5A, because you're not really discussing, feeding back why the distractors weren't correct. And hopefully if they're good enough distractors, they might have been correct, and therefore you do need a justification for why they're not. So actually, Lizelle was saying at the point of not doing a post-test staff discussion, how much less do people do post-test student review where they discuss more than the mark and also more than the one correct answer? Sure, we've got a long way to go, huh? Because theoretically, that's what's supposed to happen after every multiple choice test. That it comes sort of as a tutorial, that students can see their marks of what they marked right and wrong, and that each of those questions are discussed. Now, what does that do for departments where they keep those questions as part of question bank and they want to reuse them? So which is better, to give students detailed feedback where they're obviously going to copy the question and share it with all their cohorts and congeners, or to say, we're not discussing the test with you, you got 75%, just be happy with that, and you're not seeing the questions again, so we're not going to discuss whether it's good or whether it's not good. For our sanity, which is the better option? Let's all go ahead.
Sorry, I've just got a question on, setting. I'm not using MCQs because of my own thought process of that I can't, my language is affected. But if you set exam questions or MCQs and you want to give it to the students, is there a way of giving the question without the possible answers? Because if you don't give the answer set that goes with the question, then that's a learning opportunity.
Good idea.
Yeah, Jennifer, do you agree with that? It's a learning opportunity?
I think so. I think it's a good way of thinking of it, but it's still difficult. We've got to reset. Sorry, I didn't realize my work was still on. Okay.
It's fine. So we used to do that in pharmacology back in the day. Every test was a new test, but the exams were taken from a bank and the exams were pulled back in again. So the exam wasn't shared. Now, the truth is, first of all, people do remember, and classes go through whole schema where, each person is given a question to remember, and the instant they get out of the exam, they write it down, and then, you've got more students than questions, and so people double and triple dip so that you can make sure you got the right question. So actually questions do get out there. But Lizelle, you're right. If they don't have the mandated correct answer, then maybe it's a learning opportunity for them to go and look it up. However, you find historical question banks, and this is part of institutional culture, right? Some students sell them from year to year. We had many students who were given from year to year, and also cross degrees, because pharmacology is something that a physio does, as well as a nurse, as well as a medic, as well as a pharmacy student. And so the different banks were shared amongst students so that they could continue their revision. And there were many hundreds of years of answers on the MCQs. So, students would cover the answers with their hand and pretend that they were trying to figure it out. But actually, I'm not sure that they do. So yeah, Lizelle, maybe it is a thing that if it's a small class, you don't necessarily have to hold back the questions, and that might be easier to set more. I don't know, but certainly it's a tension between good examination practice, which would mean debriefing a whole class after the exam and discussing each question and what was right and what was wrong about it, and what the thinking process is when you deal with a question like that, and between institutional sanity, where there are only so many topics you can write decent questions on. And if you exhaust those, then you start nitpicking. And worse than that, if you exhaust those, you have to just keep recycling what you've got. And then that also becomes less of a challenge for the students. So maybe that's the tension, and maybe that's one of the reasons for some of our practices. And maybe we need to rethink how we examine in order to give better feedback or have more formative events so that students can have those discussions without us losing the entire question bank. Carol, I kind of agree with you, although the point about learning of MCQs is that it can be a great learning exercise, and yes, as long as they get the right answer. The problem comes in when we're trying to examine higher order things with an MCQ, and the thinking is not there because they're learning answers off by heart. And I think that maybe that's the differentiator there. Yeah. And that's exactly what you're saying there. The thinking questions really are the ones which would test the students. So, Mark, I'm going to ask you if you can share the spreadsheet that you showed us last week, which was all about how students interact with a question and how we decide on the basis of how the students have answered whether the question was fair or not, and whether we should have, excuse me, one clear, an institutional policy, a faculty policy, and a departmental policy about what we do with multiple choice questions. So at one stage, the School of Clinical Medicine had the policy that they would use standard setting because statistically they have more than 300 students in the class and they have more than 200 statements in a multiple choice test, and that means statistically they can use, for example, the Cohen method of standard setting, where they can determine the cut score of a test rather than just rely on a 50 or a 60%. And in addition, they can decide whether questions are fair or not fair by looking at the range of statistics that are generated by students answering questions. So you can't figure out how reliable a test is before the students have written it. All of those things that show us about reliability of the test, like the Cronbach alpha or the SEM, can only be figured out after students have answered the test. Mark, are you digging around in all of your multiple screens and able to share with us?
Let me go and share a screen, and then we can go on and show different things. So there's a screen just to look at to start with, including those things that you were talking about, the Cronbach's alpha, etc.
Yeah, can you tell us what we're looking at here? Okay,
so this current one at the moment is you've got a set of questions literally which comes in like that, which says here are the answers that were given for this examination by the students. So they've got a whole bank of questions and you've got the answers given by a student. What you end up doing is you end up analyzing those questions and sorting the data out. So firstly, the idea is that there's a model answer with a correct question, giving you the ability to mark against that model answer. And then the order, of course, is that the two biggies which everyone uses at the moment is easiness index and discrimination index. Easiness index, if we go back to it again, is the number of students or the percentage of students who answered the exam correctly. Discrimination index says that you've got to look at the the people who performed the best in the class versus those who performed the worst in class. And if you look at the sorting on the left-hand side here, you'll see that the marks are descending in order. So what the software has done here is to sort the students so that you can make those distinctions. As Shira was saying, depending on class sizes, you work out these numbers in different ways. So you can either work against, for example, here the significant percentage is 27%, which I don't know has been worked out back in the depths of time. That says if your classes are bigger than about 50, but if they're less than 50, you're looking at 50-50% when you're comparing the top and the bottom of the classes. And it does say that your discrimination index certainly is a lot more inaccurate. And then you can make this decision.
Before you carry on, I want to know if people have got that. Like, why would it be important to know if the question was easy or not? And are we only judging that it's easy because more students got it right?
Okay, yes. So there's a combination of the both, because, you know, having an easiness index of 99% says that your question was really easy and it doesn't discriminate. So the stats that you're really looking at are not so much, it's looking at the goodness of the question, but it's also looking at saying, is this exam based on the correct assumptions that you're trying to do? Or is this exam to see whether students are trained correctly, whether they have the knowledge? Or the fact in most exams is to say, are we cutting off the correct students? Are the students who are passing the guys who are determined to pass? And are the students failing the ones that we actually don't want to pass, that are not safe? And that's it. That looks at your pass mark as well, and especially the discrimination index gives you an idea of which questions are the most appropriate when deciding those kind of pass-fail questions.
Yeah. So the discrimination index will tell you essentially which ones should be able to be answered by the top enders of the class versus students who did not do so well. Right. So if it's a question that everyone gets 100% right, then it can't discriminate. Whereas with a good discrimination index, what it's saying is that this was a tough question, but the A grade students got it right. Or this was a tough question and the failing students did not get it right. Because it discriminates between those that know and those that don't know. And by the way, yes, Carol, I'm going to come to you now, but while we're listening to Carol, can everybody in the room give me a better name? Drop it in the chat for the discrimination index, because we run into endless difficulties trying to describe to people what it is and why it's important. Carol, go ahead, and people write your ideas, please, while she's talking.
So I don't have a better name for it, but one of the things, I mean, there's always this question about what's the cutoff of the easiness index and the discrimination index before you should be concerned about a question, that it's not actually, you know, that there's something technically wrong with the question or the way the students interpreted the question, so that it's you know, not a great question. And what I will quite frequently have is I'll frequently have like an 80% easiness index, but then the discrimination index is quite low. And to me, it's not discriminating because, you know, so many students are getting it right, with 80, 90 or 95% of students getting right. But my question is really, how do you actually look at these to see, you know, you say if it's 100%, if everybody gets it right, there is no discrimination index, which is clear, but kind of how do you balance them and interpreting the values? If you see my question?
Yeah, I see exactly what your question is. And there are case and Swanson cutoff numbers, right? So they'll tell you that a discrimination index mark, and I don't actually have them written here, what the cutoff would be. But yeah, there we go. You see, he's telling
this is, if you're looking at the same thing, remember that your cutoffs are fairly arbitrary. There are decisions that have been made internationally as to what are good cutoffs for those points. The reality is the decisions that you're going to make as the result of those things. So, for example, if there is information which is absolutely essential that students know, you don't really care about this discrimination. What you'd like to see is a really high easiness index. If you're trying to identify a few questions which you can use to grade other exams to say, does this exam discriminate well between good and bad? Those are the ones with the ideal marks, the ideal discriminations. So it all depends on what you're using those questions for. And I think an exam consists of little bits and pieces all built into a total exam. So there's some things you have to know. There's some questions which are put in to rate your exam against previous exams to make sure that you're hitting the same standards.
Yeah, and what he's showing you on the screen here, Carol, is the international standard of lower limit and upper limit of the discrimination index and the easiness index. So there are numbers, but the point about it is that if questions are really easy, in other words, the whole class has learned it and they're all getting it right, that can still be okay, because you want to see that they do know that stuff. Whereas the few questions that you put in with really good discrimination indices are to differentiate between the high flyers, the A graders versus everyone else. Because otherwise your exam is an exam where you're not able to differentiate between the excellent students in the class and those who are not so excellent. And is that one of the points of your assessment? It might not be. You might be wanting to look at mastery and competence, and everybody needs to get 90% before they can pass, but that's fine because the questions are questions that they know and they understand and can process. And so most people will get that number. The group of GAMP students, for example, who are flying through because the single best answer MCQs are not. They're 1 true and 3 false, which are very easy to pick up for students who have learnt their work really well. So students getting like 98 and 99% in these kinds of questions are the ones that are pushing the discrimination index right up. And yeah, so that's the question. The question is, do the stats tell you something meaningful about the way that you set up your exam? And it speaks to your exam philosophy, like what are you wanting the exam to show you? Here we're looking at this entire list of stats and saying, well, if you've got more questions with an easiness index, which shows that the whole class got 100%, then that exam it should be showing you a mastery or a competence level, versus if you're just wanting to test a whole bunch of knowledge, in which case you're probably going to be pretty sure that there's some students who know some stuff and other students who don't know some stuff, and students spot and they take chances too. So it's difficult to develop any kind of discrimination in the mastery side, but it's much easier to develop some sort of standard or discrimination on the side where students are faced with a whole bunch of work and they have to choose it.
And another thing which is not which is not looked at a lot is, if you look at this bunch of questions now, if you look at the discriminators, are your discriminators good or not? And you can see that, for example, in option C is not a particularly great discriminator in most of these things, is that however it occurred whether you've randomized your questions or not, that particular option as a distractor is not particularly effective. And even though the question as a whole might perform well, it certainly could be improved by rewriting some of the distractors.
And so Mark has got a point here, that one of the whole reasons for looking at the post-exam stats, yes, is to be fair to the students, but is also to improve your multiple choice writing. So if you see that a distractor is not performing well, let's think about maybe something that might be a better distractor. And also, if you see that every single one of your questions is being answered 100%, well, yeah, maybe you indicated where the students had to learn, or also maybe you're not testing them sufficiently. And then maybe it's just fine if they all get 100% because that's what they knew they had to know. So there's no hard and fast rule for stats, but if you look at the stats, they tell you a whole story. I just want to get to yes, exactly. It's really hard to write good distractors that are of necessity distractors and not the single best correct answer or closest correct answer, but could possibly be. Kath, let's come to your question, and then we'll take one more idea, and that is,
okay,
meaningful results, are they supposed to be on a bell curve if we look at all these stats? So the outliers, the top flying students get, there are few of them who do well, and then there aren't so many who don't do well. Here we go. Oh, Mark, I love your spreadsheets. He can just answer anything you like by looking at the numbers. So in this particular exam, they try and differentiate between application knowledge and problem solving. I've never got them to be able to absolutely define the differences that they see between those. But it is quite interesting that all the students pick up on the application questions. There's a really good bell curve there. Pretty much the same with the knowledge, and maybe with the problem solving, it's a bit shifted to the right. So they are able. Then they score. So they do a kind of expert panel standard setting. So they score the questions on a degree of difficulty from a lecturer's point of view, thinking, as we spoke about standard setting, what the just competent students should be able to do. So they class their blue questions as level 1, orange level 2, and grey as level 3, with level 1 being the easiest, right? and it's so interesting that their performance of students when they look at the spread is very different from what I think quite often the standard set of the exam is. So they try and spread the questions along the level. They try, and this is part of their blueprinting to be fair to the students. And interesting about how the students perform in this kind of a test, because these are students from 9 universities. So it's not just one lecturer and one class. It's in fact different syllabus in each university and different lecturers. And that gives rise to being able to differentiate between areas that students found easier and areas that students found difficult. So Mark, won't you talk us through the hotspot diagram, and Catherine will come back to make a final conclusion on your bell curve idea.
Okay.
So a heat map really originally was that. It was looking at data and it gives you kind of hotspots. There's 2 ways of looking at heat map data. You can either look at it in terms of trying to find the center point, which is often used, and distributions from the center point, or alternately on a scale which is from really cold to really hot, which is what I've used here. And in reality, it's quite easy to do yourself if you ever want to. What I've done here is literally set up conditional formatting, and within Excel, you can actually set up the color scales already up front. What I've done is I've used 2 additional settings to say really good versus really bad, to try and highlight areas that are being used. So the idea is green is good, red is bad. The darker the green, the worse things are. The better things are going. The darker the red, the worse things are going. And the whole idea is to try, because you're looking at different institutions. So what you're looking on the left hand is the people who are doing the from where the students came, and on the horizontal axis, what you're doing is you're looking at the various competencies and what are being covered. And the idea of this is to try and identify, firstly, the weaknesses per institution, and also the overall weaknesses as a group. So where you can see something highlighted in an external facility, the people who did the best in that group, this topic, the level 1 topics are covered well, but particularly good by a particular institution. In this case, what's happening is, although they're dealing with those level 1 topics extremely well, they're not dealing particularly well with the slightly more difficult topics. So maybe the focus of their teaching is a little bit difficult. And what you can really look for is you can look for problem areas within certain universities. So, for example, what this one is looking at is to say maybe research and non-research intensive universities and where students are possibly being pushed to look at. So the idea is you can identify weaknesses within a curriculum, especially if you've got sufficient tagging. And it's very easy to look at numbers, but they start to blur after a period of time. Whereas now, if you're purely looking to see the red bordered numbers, it's quite easy to pick them out of a hat and say, right, that particular university has a particular problem with that group of questions. And it's the whole thing with data visualization. It's meant to make your ability to identify important data and to make decisions a lot easier. And heat maps, where you've got this huge amount of data, doesn't really reflect well on a bunch of curves. But on these kind of diagrams, it's quite easy to identify both strengths and weaknesses.
Thanks, Mark. I absolutely love how you have managed to devise that easy way for us to have a look, because that's exactly the point. Here you're differentiating by institution, but also they want to differentiate by different parts of the syllabus. So, and in 3 levels. So that's application or straight knowledge or whatever the other one was, problem solving, versus a level 1 question, a level 2 question, and a level 3 question, versus was it a calculation? Was it an ethics question? Was it a straightforward, say, pharmaceutics question? So it actually gives you the whole range, and you can see which universities focus on which type of teaching, because that's how their students are performing. And it does produce some really meaningful data for the authority to feed back to the universities. And also for people to think about not only how the exam is set up, but also maybe how their teaching could change in relation to what it is that the exam's showing. So, I mean, if we were to take each one of the MCQ exams that we do with our students and submit them to this kind of a challenge, I actually think it would surprise a lot of people as to the fairness of our questions and the standard of our questions, and also the standard of students' answers. So, Kath, I think the bottom line is, you know how people used to have, like students, the great assumption, oh, it was a really hard exam, but don't worry because they'll just put us all on a curve and shift the curve. How many times have you heard students say that?
Many times.
Yeah. So that is not a faculty approach at all. What we do is we try and develop some meaningful data from the feedback that we get from exams. And then there's a set of kind of rules of thumb. For example, if the easiness index is less than 0.25, so in other words, if the majority of the class got the question wrong, some departments would only take, say, 10% of the class got it wrong. I don't know if Kennedy's still here. I'm not sure what they do in physiology. But if it's a really tiny number, and you say, well, clearly there was a problem with this question. The students didn't understand it. We're right. It's not anything that we've done in loading the question, but most of the class got it wrong. You then go to the lecturer and you say, wow, most of the class got your question wrong. And the lecturer digs their heels in and says, that is not my fault. First of all, attendance in the class was shocking. Second of all, the students that were there were playing on their phones. Third of all, they all took out their lunch and they ate it and they weren't listening to me. And fourth of all, I said it twice in the lecture and I'm not prepared to take it out. It's their fault they got it wrong. Hands up who's ever heard that discussion. Yeah, you're too scared to say, right? But I've had that discussion fairly often. Yeah, as well. So that's really a student deficit kind of approach. Yeah, Mark, go ahead, and then we'll.
Okay. No, the other thing to remember as well is that if you do have poor questions within the exams and you take them out, it will very often influence the easiness and discrimination of other questions. So the clever students who get confused and the poorer students who get confused, and then when you rerun the indices of the entire exam again, you actually find that questions which were starting to look a bit iffy now suddenly straighten themselves up.
Yeah, which is a lovely thing to actually point out, because sometimes there are questions in the whole set of stats that do start skewing the results. So that student deficit kind of approach is one that we don't really like, for the simple reason that there has to be a reason why the majority of the class got a question wrong, especially when the stats are so indicative. So when the smallest number got it right. And usually it's to do with how the question was constructed or asked. So there might just be one word that throws students in a different direction that somebody speaking a different language wouldn't necessarily see as being problematic. And only when you look at it carefully can you see. Or there might be conflicting information that students have figured out from other parts of the course, and there's a conflict and they don't really know how to answer, and so the majority choose one way, not another. What I'm trying to say is, if the stats are really, really, really low in correctness on a question, you almost have to give the students the benefit of the doubt and say there was something wrong with this question. And yeah, I'm not suggesting you take out a lot of statements, but as Mark says, the minute you start removing questions with really iffy stats, then the rest of the exam shifts. And so it's quite important to identify things that are tripping students up because they're MCQs rather than tripping students up because they don't know the knowledge. And I think that's the differentiation you have to make when you ask the question, should we take it out or not? Also, you can, because with a spreadsheet like this, you can do it really easily. You can take it out, see if it makes a difference to people, and either put it back in again or decide to take out something else. You know, it's not a huge train smash where you're manually going through each number. It's something that you can have a look to see what effect it's going to cause, and if it is something that will make a difference in terms of the fairness of the exam, I am suggesting that it should be done. What I am not suggesting is that students are party to that discussion necessarily, because you'll always get the students who then try and trade on, but ma'am, it should be taken out. And that is not a student decision. That's a decision in relation to this kind of hotspot spreadsheet that we're looking at. And then finally, when you take out the really, really iffy questions, so that also changes the Cronbach alpha, because Cronbach alpha is derived from half the statements versus the other half, and therefore it can affect the reliability of the test. Usually pushes the reliability up if you've taken out iffy statements. Yeah. Okay, so Lizelle, maybe last question. I know we're heading to 5 o'clock, but what about questions that follow on one another that might also influence performance? You mean questions that are related to each other, or just that you really struggled with question 9 and so question 10 you won't be thinking straight? Which kind of do you mean?
The first one. So this question, and if you've got this answer right, then the next question is related to the previous one, or it follows up on the previous one. I haven't even thought on your second suggestion, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that happens too. But the point about that is that in the kinds of tests we set, you actually aren't supposed to have conditional answers. That if you get question 9 wrong, then question 10 will definitely be wrong because they both depend on each other. So theoretically, in good question design, in a test of this size, you actually wouldn't do that. Oh, wow. Okay, Kat, this is our whole story. Wow. Okay, we're heading into 5 o'clock territory. So I'm reading this whole thing. The bell curve in chaos. Wow, normal distributions. You do know that my friend Hugh MacLeod says, you as a person, you personally are not the bell curve. So, yeah, okay. Cheers, Lizelle. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for coming along. And thanks particularly to Mark for showing us his very, very fancy way of looking at exams. It really encourages me when we can learn a lot from how students answer a test. And that's really what this session was about. It's about looking at ways that we can improve our assessment technique, and definitely post-test stats is a really good way of figuring out if we are writing good questions or not. So very much well worth doing. Thanks for coming along, everyone. See you again next week.